This is Carolina Ghost Towns, a podcast about the vanished towns and lost communities in South Carolina, North Carolina, and maybe a few other places. I'm your host, Tom Taylor. I love swamps. Just about any time I say this to someone, they make some disparaging comment about snakes, alligators, and bugs. My guess is that they have never truly experienced a swamp adventure and have given over to the fear generated by popular culture. The unknown can be scary. I especially love cypress swamps with old-growth trees. When you get back into these dense stands, the whole atmosphere takes on an otherworldly quality. One section of Sparkleberry Swamp in Sumter County, South Carolina, I call the Cathedral. The tall trees are like buttresses holding up a vaulted Gothic arch canopy. Even the sound is different. Prothonotary warblers and other songbirds echo off the vegetation, adding to the impression of being in a large, enclosed space. I'm always tempted to start singing a Gregorian chant in there just to see how it would sound, but I'm afraid the wildlife and my fellow kayakers wouldn't approve. As much as I love swamps, I don't think I'd like living in one. A day visit or even an overnight camping trip is fine with me, but I'm addicted to creature comforts like air conditioning. Today's ghost town is set in a cypress swamp in Georgia. The settlement of Ebenezer was established deep in the swamps of Ebenezer Creek, a tributary of the Savannah River. Ebenezer Swamp has its own cathedral of cypress trees. This seems appropriate, as the settlement started as a refuge from religious persecution. However, it ended up as the site of a tragedy during the American Civil War. The Counter-Reformation in Europe led to mass immigration of various Protestant groups. They were seeking refuge from persecution under the Catholic-ruled and highly misnamed Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman, according to Voltaire. These groups included the French Huguenots, the Moravians, the Palatines, and the Salzburgers. Many immigrants from these Protestant sects settled in the Carolinas and Georgia, seeking a place where they could worship freely. James Oglethorpe was the founder of the colony of Georgia and the city of Savannah. Initially, he set up the colony as a buffer between the Spanish in Florida and the English in the Carolinas. Oglethorpe welcomed these dispossessed groups. The more people that he could persuade to settle in his new colony, the better they would be able to fend off the Spanish. In 1731, Count Leopold Anthony of Firmian, Archbishop of Salzburg, issued an edict that ordered the Protestants of his realm to recant their beliefs and convert to Catholicism or emigrate. Over 20,000 Protestants were forced to leave their homes. A group of these Salzburger immigrants, led by Reverend Johann Martin Boltzius, arrived in Charleston in 1734, then traveled to Savannah. They were met by James Oglethorpe himself. Oglethorpe set aside a plot of land for the Salzburger settlement along the banks of Ebenezer Creek, about 6 miles from its confluence with the Savannah River. At this point, I'm not sure which came first, the name of Ebenezer Creek or the name of the town. I suspect that the Salzburgers named both the town and the creek. The name Ebenezer was a commemoration of God's assistance. Boltzius, a pious Lutheran, surely felt that the trials that they had to overcome were only through God's help. He even noted as much in his diary. One of the hymns sung by the new colonists was Auf Ebenezer, werde heut zu Gottes Lob erweckt, or Up Ebenezer, be awakened to the praise of God. Even as a scholar of hymnody, I haven't been able to locate that hymn, but it just gives evidence that they provided the name for the creek as well as the town. The original site for Ebenezer proved unsuitable. Many of the Salzburgers died due to complications from infectious diseases during their journey, and once they arrived in Georgia, Boltzius insisted that these deaths were due to God's works and that the intervention was only a test of their faith. He also partially blamed Oglethorpe for these deaths because of his poor choice of location for the settlement. Boltzius petitioned Oglethorpe to let the group move to higher land closer to the Savannah River, which would be more fertile and allow better access by boat. Like me, I guess he didn't want to live in a swamp either. Initially, Oglethorpe denied the request. Boltzius threatened to disband the community if they did not receive permission to relocate. In 1737, Oglethorpe recanted and allowed the Salzburgers to move their settlement to Red Bluff, overlooking the Savannah River. This location was named New Ebenezer. There, Boltzius established the Jerusalem Lutheran Church. Despite the disagreement over the location of the settlement, Boltzius agreed with Oglethorpe on most things. Oglethorpe had prohibited slavery and the sale of rum in the new colony, and Boltzius was all for that. Unlike the large plantations in South Carolina, Oglethorpe envisioned smaller farms managed by the common folk. Following Oglethorpe's plan, Reverend Boltzius sought to build, quote, a religious utopia on the Georgia frontier, close quote, according to his diary. The town of New Ebenezer thrived in its new location. Silkworms and silk production were the major source of trade, but there were other businesses as well. Despite the ban on rum and spirits, there was a tavern in the town. Thomas Bichler was a planter and farmer in the area. Boltzius wrote in his diary that, quote, Bichler, a reasonable and skilled Salzburger, whose plantation and household are situated near the mill, has been appointed as miller, close quote. In 1743, Boltzius describes Bichler's role as a tavern keeper in Ebenezer.
Some time ago, with the approval of the community, the Salzburger Bichler began to establish a tavern in an orderly and Christian manner, not for the harm but for the use and convenience of his neighbors. For this, he recently received, in my presence and at my recommendation, a written permission or license. In it is written his duty, namely, not to allow any disorder, gambling, or such likes, and that he will appear at Easter again before the council with 2 witnesses from whose mouths they wish to hear about his conduct. The license serves primarily to prevent any barroom from arising in that it forbids any and every person at our place to sell or serve strong drinks to guests. We greatly need an orderly host among us, not only for the sake of the local inhabitants, but also for the sake of strangers. For otherwise the people come to our houses as if they were taverns and demand everything for money or gratis, and if they are refused, they grumble.
So, Bichler's Tavern was more of an inn and not a place that served drinks as we normally would think of a tavern. Toward the end of his life, Boltzius promoted slavery and even purchased his own slaves, though privately he decried the practice. He was afraid that his opposition to slavery would endanger himself and his town, since the surrounding area was pro-slavery. Johann Boltzius died in 1765, leaving a void in the leadership of Ebenezer. During the Revolutionary War, considerable damage was done to Ebenezer, but it managed to hang on. It even served as the capital of Georgia for a while. John Adam Tweitlin, a resident of Ebenezer, served as the first elected governor of the state of Georgia. Ebenezer was also the county seat of Effingham County. Later, the courthouse was moved into the town of Springfield, which was more centrally located in the county. Many businesses moved with the county seat, leaving few residents in New Ebenezer. By 1855, the town was largely abandoned. Jerusalem Lutheran Church was one of the last buildings remaining in the town. However, the tale of Ebenezer was far from over. During the Civil War in 1864, General William T. Sherman began his march to the sea. The following is from a post on the U.S. Slaves blog. This was written much better than I could, so I'm just going to read a large portion of it. I'll link to the blog in the show notes. Quote, as Sherman's troops continued south, they began to attract a large number of slaves. To many of these slaves, Sherman's troops represented a chance for freedom. Soon, entire slave families began gathering up their meager possessions and following the Union troops. Upon reaching the area surrounding Ebenezer Swamp, Union troops found that the heavy rains caused the riverbanks to overflow, washing away the roads. It was also discovered that while they were retreating, Confederate soldiers had destroyed the bridge over Ebenezer Creek, which was the only way to cross the swamp. In addition, nearby Confederates had begun to sporadically fire upon the Union soldiers from their hiding places along the Savannah River. Seeing the need to cross Ebenezer Swamp as soon as possible, Union General Jefferson C. Davis, not to be confused with Confederate President Jefferson Davis, immediately ordered the construction of a crude bridge. Davis also began to worry that large numbers of slaves would impede his troops' progress. And so Davis gave orders that the slaves were to stand aside and wait until the Union troops had all safely crossed first. On a dark, rainy night, the bridge was finally completed, and Davis gave the order to cross. As instructed, the slaves stood silently and waited their turn. However, as the Union troops crossed, Confederates opened fire. In the darkness, it was unclear as to where the Confederates were stationed. Davis feared that the enemy would use the bridge as a means for attacking his troops from the rear. And so, as soon as the last of his men were safely across, Davis ordered the bridge destroyed. Upon seeing the bridge collapse, fear raced through the crowd of slaves gathered on the water's edge. They had all heard the horror stories from other slaves and were convinced that if the Confederate army captured them, they would be killed. And so, one by one, thousands of men, women, and children jumped into the raging water in a last-ditch attempt at freedom. Davis ordered his troops to ignore the cries for help and to continue moving forward. And while there were accounts of a few Union soldiers felling large trees in an attempt to create a makeshift bridge, the sad fact is that most of the slaves were simply left to drown. It is said that so many perished in the water that for some time after, their bodies piled high enough to create a macabre dam before finally washing away. Close quote. It is said that ghosts of these slaves still haunt the swamps of Ebenezer Creek. Today, there isn't much left of the town of Ebenezer. There's a monument marking the location of Old Ebenezer deep in the swamp. In New Ebenezer, overlooking the Savannah River, Jerusalem Evangelical Lutheran Church still stands as the oldest church building in Georgia and the oldest continuously active Lutheran congregation in the United States. The church and Ebenezer Township were added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1974. The Georgia Salzburgers have constructed a museum on the site with several cabins and historical displays. There is a statue of Johann Boltzius on the grounds of Jerusalem Church. I've made a couple of kayaking trips down Ebenezer Creek. The swamp is beautiful, with its tall cypress trees and remote location. At one point, we reached a series of pilings on either side of the creek. It's possible that this was the bridge hastily built by Union troops and the site of so many deaths. Every time I've been through there, I remember those lives lost as they sought their freedom. A couple of last thoughts about the name Ebenezer. As a church musician, one of my favorite hymns is "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing." I just love the lilting melody, and I still play it regularly on the banjo. Of course, when I got to the line, quote, "Here I raise mine Ebenezer, hither by thy help I'm come," close quote, my brain reverts to its 15-year-old self and I have to stifle a giggle. Lastly, thanks to Charles Dickens, the name Ebenezer is forever associated with the ghost of Marley and the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. The name Ebenezer now brings up images of a miserly, sad man. I have to wonder if Dickens meant some irony in the choice of names. The Hebrew word Ebenezer was a commemoration of divine intervention, yet Ebenezer Scrooge championed self-reliance above all else. I always thought it was a shame that the name Scrooge evokes images of a miser, rather than the redemptive story of Ebenezer Scrooge at the end of the Dickens story. As for the Ebenezer of our story, perhaps the redemption is in the beauty of the creek and the endurance of the Jerusalem Lutheran congregation. As with the Dickens story, there are ghosts, but we can remember those ghosts and trust that a tragedy like this never happens again. And that's it for this episode of Carolina Ghost Towns. Links to more information about Ebenezer are available in the show notes. As always, please subscribe and recommend us to your friends and even your enemies. I'd also appreciate it if you would rate and review the show. Thank you for listening.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.
Thanks for listening. The opening music was composed by Lex FM with additional music from Pixabay. The song Southern Ghost Town was generated by Suno AI. All other music was composed and recorded by me, Tom Taylor. Carolina Ghost Towns is a part of the Random Connections empire. It's pretty much a one-man show, so I wear all the hats, including producer, writer, researcher, sound engineer, publicist, and bartender. If you like the show, please subscribe on your favorite pod venue and be sure to give us feedback. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for the show, you can reach me at carolinaghosttownspod@gmail.com. For more information and show notes, visit randomconnections.com. Thank you.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.